Most people respond to a lie with more evidence. That is the exact response a narcissist is counting on. Because the moment you present proof, you have already agreed to play a game with no real rules, a game built entirely around exhausting you until the truth stops mattering. A narcissist does not lie to your face because they expect to be believed. They lie because they are testing whether you will still perform the argument, whether you will still explain, defend, and dissect something you already know is false. There is one specific response, quiet and almost unnervingly simple, that removes their footing entirely, not by proving them wrong, but by refusing to enter the argument they built the lie to create. The moment you use it, something visible happens on their face, a flicker of confusion where confidence used to be, because for the first time, their lie has nowhere left to go. To understand why this response works, you have to understand what a lie actually is for someone with narcissistic patterns. It is rarely a simple attempt to hide the truth. Most people lie to avoid a consequence, hoping the lie goes unnoticed. A narcissist lies differently. Their lie is often delivered in plain sight, sometimes even when the truth is obvious. Sometimes even when you were standing right there and saw what happened with your own eyes. This is not a mistake in their strategy. It is the strategy. The lie is not designed to convince you of a false version of events. It is designed to see whether you will still treat them as the authority on reality, even when reality is staring you in the face. This is why the size of the lie often does not matter. Small lies about where they were, what they said, who they talk to, exist for the same purpose as larger ones. Each one is a small test of your willingness to participate in a distorted version of events. If you argue, you have accepted the premise that this is a debate with two equally valid sides. If you gather more evidence, you have accepted the premise that evidence is what determines the outcome. But evidence was never the deciding factor in these interactions. Compliance was. A narcissistic person is not measuring whether you can prove your case. They are measuring whether you will still show up to argue it. This is where most people make an understandable but costly mistake. They believe that if they can just present enough proof, screenshots, timestamps, witnesses, the narcissist will be forced to acknowledge what happened. It feels logical because in a healthy relationship, evidence resolves disagreements. Two people who both want an accurate understanding of events will eventually align once the facts are clear. But narcissistic patterns are not built around a shared interest in accuracy. They are built around control. Evidence does not threaten the lie. It threatens their sense of authority, and that is a very different problem, one that no amount of proof can solve. So when you slide your phone across the table with the message that contradicts what they just said, or you calmly list the 3 separate times they told you something different, you are not cornering them the way it feels like you are. You are actually opening a new front for them to work with. Now they have specific details to attack. Now they can question the wording of the message, the timing of the screenshot, the reliability of your memory, the motives behind why you saved that conversation in the first place. Every piece of evidence you offer becomes new material, not a dead end for them, but a new door for the conversation to walk through. This is why confrontations with a narcissistic person can feel like arguing with smoke. You reach for something solid and it dissolves the moment you touch it, only to reform somewhere else. You bring up the lie about where they were, and suddenly you are discussing whether you have trust issues. You bring up the contradiction in their story, and suddenly you are discussing why you keep score of everything they say. You bring up the objective, undeniable fact, and somehow, 20 minutes later, you are the one apologizing. This is not because your evidence was weak. It is because evidence was never the actual subject of the conversation. If this pattern sounds familiar, if you have ever left a conversation feeling like you lost an argument you know you were right about, take a moment to consider why. It was never really about who was right. It was about who controlled where the conversation went. And for a long time, the answer was them. There is a reason this particular tactic works so reliably, and it has less to do with the narcissist's cleverness than most people assume. It works because it exploits something deeply human, the assumption that conversations are a shared project. Most people walk into a disagreement believing that both sides are, at some level, trying to arrive at the same understanding of events. That assumption is so automatic that it rarely gets questioned. You do not consciously decide to believe the other person wants clarity as much as you do. You simply act as though they do, because that has been true of nearly every other relationship in your life. A narcissistic person benefits enormously from this blind spot because as long as you are operating on that assumption, you will keep offering them exactly what they need to keep the interaction alive, your continued participation. This is also why the lie often does not need to be believable to succeed. Many people are confused when they look back and realize the story a narcissist told them did not even make logical sense, and yet the argument still dragged on for an hour. The believability of the lie was never the point. Its function was to create an opening, a doorway through which a longer interaction could unfold. Once you step through that doorway by responding, explaining, or correcting, the specific content of the lie becomes almost irrelevant. The conversation has already achieved its purpose, which was never about the truth. It was about keeping you inside a loop where they, not you, decide when the exchange ends. Understanding this reframes the entire situation. You are not failing to win an argument. There was no argument to win, because an argument requires two people interested in the same outcome. What you were actually navigating was a test, repeated over and over, sometimes daily, sometimes over small things that barely seemed worth mentioning. Each test asked the same underlying question in a different costume. Will you still show up? Will you still try to be understood? Will you still believe that if you just explain yourself clearly enough, this time will be different? The exhausting part is not any single lie. It is the accumulation of hundreds of these tests, each one quietly training you to keep reaching for a resolution that was never on offer. If any part of this is landing because you have lived it, not just imagined it, take a moment now to subscribe, because the rest of what follows gets even more specific about how to actually use this in the moment it happens. It is also worth naming what tends to happen to a person's confidence over months or years of this pattern. You start to doubt your own read on basic situations. You replay conversations looking for the moment you said something wrong, something that could explain why a simple factual disagreement turned into you apologizing. You may start rehearsing conversations in advance, trying to anticipate every possible twist so you can head it off before it happens. This is exhausting in a way that is difficult to explain to someone who has not lived it, because from the outside, it can look like a minor disagreement about where someone was on a Tuesday night. From the inside, it can feel like defending your grip on reality itself. Now here is the response that changes everything, the one specific reaction that takes their footing away without a single raised voice. When they lie to your face, you do not argue. You do not present evidence. You do not ask them to explain the inconsistency. You simply say some version of, "That's not what happened, and I'm not going to discuss it further." Then you stop. No follow-up, no justification, no waiting for them to concede. You let the silence that follows do the work that 1,000 pieces of evidence never could. This works because it removes the two things a narcissistic person's strategy depends on: engagement and uncertainty. Engagement is fuel. Every time you argue, defend, or re-explain, you are handing them material to twist, redirect, or exhaust you with. When you refuse to engage past a single, calm statement of fact, there is no material left to work with. You have said what is true, and you are no longer offering anything for them to attack, question, or distort. The conversation cannot continue in its usual form because you are no longer supplying the other half of it. Uncertainty is the second piece. Narcissistic behavior often relies on your hesitation, your instinct to be fair, to hear them out, to consider that maybe you misunderstood. That hesitation is exactly what allows the lie room to survive. A short, unwavering statement removes that room entirely. There is no ambiguity in, "That's not what happened." There is nothing to negotiate in, "I'm not going to discuss it further." You are not asking them to agree with you. You are simply refusing to pretend their version has equal standing with reality. This is the flicker you will start to notice. That brief, almost startled look that crosses their face in the half second after you say it, and then stop talking. It happens because their entire approach depends on your participation. They expected an argument, a defense, a plea for them to see reason. What they got instead was a closed door. And a closed door cannot be picked apart the way an open argument can. It helps to understand exactly what is happening behind that flicker, because it is not confusion in the sense of not understanding what you said. They understood you perfectly. What destabilizes them is the absence of a script to respond to. Narcissistic interactions tend to follow familiar choreography, a move and a counter-move they have rehearsed across dozens of similar conversations with you and, likely, with people before you. They lie, you react, they twist, you defend, they escalate, you either give in or exhaust yourself trying not to. That choreography has worked for them for a long time, which is exactly why they keep using it. When you deliver a calm, closed statement, instead of the expected reaction, you are not just declining to argue. You are removing a step from a dance they have relied on to stay in control, and for a moment, they genuinely do not know what comes next. This is also why tone matters as much as the words themselves. The statement only works if it is delivered without anger, without a raised voice, and without the tight, defensive edge that so often creeps in after months of feeling unheard. Anger, even justified anger, gives them something familiar to respond to. It signals that you are still emotionally inside the interaction, still reachable, still capable of being provoked into round two. Calm delivery denies them that opening entirely. It communicates that you are not reacting from a wound they can press on. You are simply stating a fact and moving on with your day, the same way you might state that it is raining outside. There is nothing in a flat, matter-of-fact tone for them to escalate against. What often follows is an attempt to force the door back open. They may repeat the lie, louder this time, or accuse you of refusing to listen, or claim you are being cold, dismissive, unfair. This is not a sign that your response failed. It is a sign that it worked. You have taken away their usual tool, so they are reaching for a new one, trying to provoke the exact reaction they are used to getting. The temptation here is enormous, because everything in you may want to correct the record one more time to make sure they understand you are not confused, not gullible, not backing down. Resist that pull. The moment you re-explain, you have reopened the door you just closed, and you will find yourself back in the same maze you were trying to leave. What often follows the repeated lie or the accusation of coldness is something even more specific, an attempt to make the conversation about your reaction rather than their original lie. You may hear that you are being dramatic, that you always shut down instead of communicating, that a healthy partner or friend or family member would talk things through instead of walking away. This is one of the more disorienting moves in the pattern because it takes the very tool that is protecting you and reframes it as the problem. Recognizing this in the moment matters more than almost anything else in this entire process. Your refusal to argue is not a communication failure. It is the one form of communication they cannot manipulate, and that is precisely why they are trying so hard to convince you it is wrong. The discomfort you may feel in that silence is not a sign you are doing something wrong. It is the discomfort of doing something new, something that goes against everything you have been conditioned to believe about how disagreements are supposed to be resolved. You were taught that conversations end with understanding, that conflict resolves through explanation, that the truth eventually wins out if you just present it clearly enough. None of that applies here, and unlearning it is often harder than learning the response itself. This discomfort tends to show up physically before it shows up as a clear thought. Your chest may tighten. Your instinct may scream at you to fill the silence, to soften what you said, to add just one more sentence explaining that you are not trying to be difficult. That urge is not a character flaw. It is the residue of every previous conversation where silence was punished, where walking away was treated as an escalation rather than a boundary. Your nervous system learned, through repetition, that staying engaged was the safer option, even when staying engaged meant losing. Retraining that response takes time, and it is worth being patient with yourself while it happens. The first few times you try this, it may feel unnatural, even wrong, precisely because it is unfamiliar. That feeling fades with repetition, not with waiting for it to feel comfortable before you start. There is also a quieter shift happening inside you during this process, one that matters just as much as anything happening on their face. Every time you choose the short, factual statement over the long defense, you are reinforcing something to yourself, not just to them. You are telling yourself that your perception of events does not require their approval to be valid. You do not need them to agree that the lie was a lie in order for it to be one. Reality does not depend on consensus, especially not the consensus of someone who benefits from you doubting it. This is often the part people underestimate. The response is not just a tactic for managing a difficult conversation. It is a form of practice, a repeated demonstration to yourself that you can hold your own reality steady, even when someone is actively trying to shake it. Over time, this consistency becomes its own kind of proof. Not proof aimed at them, but proof aimed at you, that you are capable of trusting what you saw, what you heard, and what you know, without needing their confirmation. There is a compounding effect to this practice that is easy to miss the first few times you try it. The first time you use the short close statement, it may feel shaky, like you are bluffing your way through confidence you do not fully feel yet. By the 10th or 20th time, something shifts. The statement stops feeling like a technique you are performing and starts feeling like an accurate description of where you actually stand. You are not pretending to be unbothered by the lie. You genuinely start to care less about winning the argument and more about protecting your own time and clarity. That shift from performing calm to actually feeling it tends to be the point where people describe finally feeling like themselves again around someone who spent years making them feel like a stranger to their own judgment. It also changes what you notice in future interactions, not just with this particular person, but with anyone who tries a similar move. Once you have practiced recognizing the shape of a false argument, an argument built to exhaust rather than resolve, you start seeing that shape more quickly elsewhere. You become less susceptible to the same tactic from a coworker, a family member, or a new partner, because you have already learned what it feels like from the inside, and you have already built the muscle to step out of it early rather than after months of damage. In that sense, this response is not just useful for one relationship. It becomes a permanent addition to how you evaluate every future conversation where something feels off. It is worth being honest about what this response does not do. It does not make a narcissistic person admit wrongdoing. It does not guarantee an apology, and it will not transform the relationship into something built on mutual honesty overnight. What it does is far more practical and in many ways more valuable. It removes you from a cycle that was never designed to reach resolution in the first place. You stop spending your energy trying to win something that was never a fair contest, and you start protecting the one thing that was always within your control: how much of yourself you hand over to a conversation built on sand. If you have already tried this and noticed that flicker, that brief pause before they scramble for a new angle, you already understand something most people spend years failing to grasp. The lie was never really about the specific claim they made. It was about whether you would still show up to argue with someone who had no intention of ever telling you the truth. There is one more layer worth sitting with, because it explains why this response can feel almost unsettling in its simplicity the first time it works. Most people expect that standing up to manipulation requires confrontation, a dramatic moment where the truth is finally spoken loudly enough to break through. What actually breaks through is the opposite. It is the quiet, unglamorous refusal to keep performing a role you were cast in without ever agreeing to it. There is no applause in that moment, no visible victory, just a closed door and a slightly rattled expression on the other side of it. That lack of drama is exactly why it works. Drama is what they know how to survive. Quiet, unwavering clarity is not. It also helps to remember that this response is not about changing them. Nothing about a short, calm statement is designed to teach a narcissistic person empathy, or to finally make them see the impact of years of dishonesty. That outcome, however much you may still hope for it somewhere underneath the exhaustion, is not something you can produce through any phrase, tactic, or amount of patience. What this response actually changes is your position inside the interaction. You stop being a participant in a game engineered to have no winner and start becoming someone who simply declines to play. That distinction between trying to win and refusing to compete is where the real shift in power actually happens. For anyone who is in the middle of this right now, still gathering screenshots, still rehearsing the perfect rebuttal, still convinced that one more piece of evidence will finally make them see it, consider setting that effort down. Not because you are wrong, you already know you are not, but because the version of you who stops performing the argument is stronger than the version of you who wins it. And once you experience what it feels like to close that door calmly and walk away from it without looking back, you will understand why silence, used deliberately, has always said more than any amount of proof ever could. If this perspective is giving you language for something you have lived through but never quite had words for, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. There are more people than you realize sitting in that same silence right now, learning the same lesson, one calm sentence at a time.